Chapter 1652, Terrible Challenger Next. 2 weeks after Sonny had returned to Antarctica, he stood on a cliff overseeing a vast scene of devastation. In front of him, a great valley was formed from collapsed mountains and stone debris, the ruinous landscape now covered in ice and snow. This was the place where Sky Tide, Wake of Ruin, and Dire Fang had battled the three emerged titans, Whispering Legion, Goliath, and Winter Beast. The Whispering Legion had been slain, while the other two calamitous abominations drove the saints away. An entire span of the mountain range had been demolished in the process. There were nightmare gates hidden under the crushed stone, without a doubt, or maybe above it. Sonny could not see, because most of the valley was hidden by a raging blizzard. This blizzard was the very same that had once enveloped Falcon Scott, sapping the lives of all its remaining inhabitants. It was the manifestation of the Winter Beast's authority. The air was so cold that each breath Sonny took felt like he was swallowing a scattering of sharp knives. Not paying it any attention, he was gazing down with an expressionless face, his eyes drowning in deep darkness. His gaunt body was encased in fearsome onyx armor, and that armor was shrouded in darkness. Out there in the valley, far below, a long line of nightmare creatures was advancing into the blizzard. Their movements were still and unnatural, as if they were corpses animated by some unknown force. But at the same time, none of them showed any fear or hesitation. Neither did they show the demented frenzy inherent to most abominations. They just slowly marched into the snow, stretching into a wide line that seemed to encompass the front of the blizzard. A few moments later, the first of the nightmare creatures collapsed, its corpse swiftly becoming encased in ice. Standing on the tall cliff, Sonny pursed his lips in disdain. Weak. Not that he needed these useless things to be strong. No, their purpose was different. It was to show him which type of nightmare creature was the most resistant to the Winter Beast's cold. From what he could tell, the cursed thing was not that powerful physically, at least as far as titans went. It did not rule a legion of powerful minions, either. What made the Winter Beast so lethal was its uncanny ability to freeze everything around it to death, corporeal or incorporeal, weak or strong, pure or corrupted. Close to the heart of the blizzard, even time itself seemed slower, as if the chilling cold could freeze the very laws of existence. Sonny might have been burning with murderous hatred, but he had not lost his reason. If he wanted to kill this corrupted titan, he needed to understand it first. Only after dismantling the secrets of the Winter Beast's power would he be able to slay it. And these thralls were the sacrifice he had prepared to throw into the deathly cold to comprehend it. Soon they disappeared from sight. Sonny could not see his sacrificial pawns anymore, but Soul's serpent still shared a connection with them. Therefore, he could know if the larvae were still moving or had fallen still. There were all kinds of nightmare creatures under his command, and by studying which ones lasted longer, he would be able to determine a few things about the lethal cold. Come on, die for me. And yet in the end, Sonny was disappointed, because none of them lasted long. The small army of thralls he had so laboriously created in the past few weeks was obliterated in mere minutes, none of them making it that far into the snowstorm. The cold did not differentiate between large monsters or small, those with affinity to ice or those without. All of them were drained of warmth or frozen solid, dying a meaningless death in the embrace of the Winter Beast's unholy power. Sonny cursed, then sighed with regret. No matter. The absence of a result was a result in and of itself. The fact that there did not seem to be a kind of resistance effective against the authority of the Winter Beast's profane domain told Sonny a lot, as well. He had contemplated several strategies for just that kind of outcome. These strategies were risky, yes, but actually he did not feel regretful, because they were also much more direct and brutal. Killing the wretched titan in such a fashion was bound to be much more satisfying. Down in the crumbled valley, the blizzard suddenly expanded, as if coming to life. A terrible wind blew, crushing into Sunny with a chilling force. The wall of swirling snow and ice particles slowly advanced, moving in his direction. A dark smile split his face in half. "Look at that serpent, we seem to have been spotted." He had hoped that hiding in the shadows on top of a distant mountain would be enough to throw the Titan off his scent, but he had been wrong. Perhaps the creature had been aware of his presence all along, but did not bother to react until he dared to challenge it directly. In any case, the corrupted Titan, Winter Beast, was finally rising to deal with the transcendent terror, Sunless. Sunny let out a sigh, then moved his shoulders to stretch his stiff muscles. "I guess I'll have to finish the preparations faster." With that, he glanced at the towering figure of the Mountain King that stood in the darkness behind him. Under his gaze, the tyrant suddenly turned into a torrent of black liquid, which then reformed itself into a different, equally ghastly abomination. A spire messenger now stood on the edge of the cliff, its terrifying black beak cutting the wind like a dark blade. The creature's once pale body was now utterly black, and its many powerful limbs pierced the ice with long, sharp talons. Throwing one last look at the approaching snowstorm, Sunny jumped onto its back. In the next moment, the mighty wings of the creature raised a hurricane, and it shot into the air, carrying him back in the direction of Erebus Field. The snowstorm followed. The monstrous spire messenger tore apart the jellied wind as it raced across the frigid vastness of the twilight sky. Behind it, a churning wall of dancing snow crawled slowly, devouring the world like a hungry beast. There was a gaunt figure kneeling on the back of the flying monster, clutching at its black feathers with an onyx gauntlet. Sunny did not look back, knowing that serpent was much faster than the pursuing Titan. In that, at least, they held an advantage. It will catch up soon enough, though. He was contemplating the results of sacrificing his swarm of thralls. None of them had been able to withstand the lethal cold of the Winter Beast's domain for long, which meant that there was no type of resistance that could help Sunny survive there. At least none he could find in a short amount of time. The thralls had perished swiftly, sapped of warmth of life. Their bodies fell into the snow, slowly turning into ice sculptures. The conclusion, then, was that Sunny had to use something other than a living being to reach the heart of the snowstorm. That would suggest that an undead creature would fare better, but that was not true. There had been a few ghouls among the thralls, and they died just the same. But there is a much simpler solution. He didn't have to enter the heart of the sinister blizzard himself or send one of his shadows. He could simply use an inanimate object. A projectile. Indeed, the simplest solution was most often the correct one. The best way to kill the Winter Beast was to simply bring down a deluge of ranged attacks on its head, or whatever it was that it had instead of a head. Sunny had not been able to do something like that in the past because there was no telling where the Titan's actual manifestation hid within the vast snowstorm. Now, however, his shadow sense could extend across many kilometers. Even if he failed to find the Winter Beast's precise location, he could at least pinpoint the general area. That is if that thing even has a physical body. For all I know, it could be a sentient storm. That was one of the risks he had to face. The other problem was actually delivering a ranged attack across such a vast distance. Not only was it physically hard, but the fatal cold and the hurricane wind raging within the snowstorm would become an obstacle. The closer one got to its heart, the worse they became. But where there was a will, there was a way. And if that will was killing intent, someone was going to die by the end of their battle, one way or another. Leaning forward to resist the frigid wind, Sunny smiled. Some time later, he was sitting on the snow, shielded from the wind by a wall of onyx scales. That wall, of course, was Serpent's side. His shadow's sole beast form had grown truly immense now that it was a transcendent terror. Serpent was still far from reaching Daron's size, of course, but it was rather daunting nevertheless. Its maw looked like it could swallow an entire military APC whole. The two of them were in the middle of the icy plain that had been Erebus Field once. Most of the destroyed siege capital was buried under lava rock and snow, with only a few ravaged structures protruding above it like skeletal remains. Sonny was sitting with the tall peak of Mount Erebus behind him. In front of him, far in the distance, the world was slowly disappearing beneath a veil of swirling snow. The already dismal temperature was dropping by the minute, and the winds were growing more violent. He looked disinterested, staring at the snow with a frozen expression. The deep darkness of his eyes was cold and placid, like the surface of an ocean ready to explode into a raging storm. "It has finally arrived, huh?" Sonny took a deep breath and finally looked up, studying the distant snowstorm. Its approach was deceptively slow, but he knew that the wall of snow would consume everything around him very soon. Serpent hissed, the deep sound of its voice reverberating across the icy plain. "It's time to start then." Sonny's words hung in the frigid air for a moment, and were swiftly swallowed by the howling of the wind. A split second later, though, the world shook. Cracks formed on the vast field of snow, and far behind him, the mouth of Mount Erebus suddenly exploded with a gargantuan pillar of ash. A terrifying gust of hot wind rolled across the desolate landscape, pushing back the cold for a moment. Then, the volcano shone with an angry red glow, and a fountain of incandescent lava shot skyward with a deafening roar. Mount Erebus was erupting. Of course, it did not just happen to erupt precisely when Sonny needed it. Instead, he had sent Fiend into its depths to find a ripe magma chamber and cause an eruption when the time was right. With Goliath having already destabilized the entire region, doing so was not too hard, and with Fiend's robust steel carapace and fire affinity, he could survive inside a volcanic explosion without much trouble. Granted, the little hoodlum would not be happy with its master once he returned. If both of them survived what was coming next, of course. As the wall of swirling snow approached Sonny from the front, devouring the world, a rolling cloud of ash spread from Mount Erebus behind him. The stench of sulfur permeated the frigid air, cold wind crashing into a wave of heat in an invisible collision. Sonny's hair danced as a vast darkness swallowed the sky, plunging the icy plain in its shadow. As everything around him became enveloped in shadows, a sinister smile appeared on Sonny's pale face. He stretched and then slowly rose to his feet. The cold darkness dwelling in his eyes finally exploded, turning into vicious glee. Looking at the approaching storm, Sonny raised his fist and said, his voice trembling with barely suppressed rage, "Hey, winter beast, do you remember me?" Then his voice grew calmer and colder, full of murderous wrath. "Probably not, but I remember you." As ash rained from the sky and the ground quaked, Sonny inhaled deeply and extended his shadow sense as far as he could. Soon, his mind was flooded with an avalanche of sensory data, almost making him dizzy. He was still unaccustomed to how vast his sight was now. Of course, he didn't actually see anything, but after years of perceiving the shapes and movements of the shadows, it was not much different. Sonny had tested his limits while relying on his shadow sense to stay alive in the ocean, but the dark depths were different from land. They were unfathomable and empty, with nothing but the cold currents to see. Here in the Antarctic center, though, there was almost too much to sense. Further, and further still, Sonny filtered out the useless data to keep his transcendent mind from overloading, and reached across many kilometers of cracking ice toward the approaching snowstorm. Soon, he sensed the shadows trembling from the lethal cold. Even they were not spared from the cruel tyranny of the winter beast. Somewhere between 40 and 50 kilometers, This is as far as I can reach. His shadow sense reached further than his actual sight, which was limited due to the curvature of Earth. And yet, it wasn't enough to find the heart of the vast blizzard, at least not until it got closer and enveloped him. Still, it is already close enough for the initial greeting. Sunny extended a hand. A thin pillar of darkness rose from the ground, growing to stand at almost twice his height. Then it solidified, turning into an inky black javelin with a needle-sharp tip. He grasped and weighed it, looking at the towering wall of swirling snow with a cold expression. He had created the javelin in the image of the siege souvenir, a similar weapon he had once fashioned to slay Goliath. The original souvenir had been made from the quill of a corrupted abomination, while this one was merely a manifested shadow. However, that shadow had been suffused with his transcendent essence, and was thus equal to a transcendent weapon. A uniquely powerful one at that, due to the fact that his soul had been altered by soul weave. Sadly, the shadow javelin lacked the powerful enchantments that the real siege souvenir had possessed. Still, it was not bad for an opening salvo. Exhaling slowly, Sunny took a step forward. Using the full augmentation of his 5 shadows, he infused a torrent of essence into his muscles and tendons, pushed against the ground with his feet, and strained his entire body to whip his hand forward and send the javelin into the dark sky. The moment he threw it, the world quaked again. A cloud of ashen snow exploded from under his feet, and a thunderous boom tore through the roaring of the eruption. There was an invisible shockwave that pushed the snow and the falling ash away, creating a sphere of clarity around his ominous onyx figure for a few fleeting moments. The javelin was like a black comet as it shot across the lightless sky, its speed immeasurable. However, the actual process was rather dull. It actually took it an entire minute to reach the wall of snow and disappear into it. 20 or so seconds later, Sunny felt his connection to the infused essence disappear. At the same time, he sensed the javelin plummet into the snow and shatter into countless shards of ice, which then dissolved into an intangible shadow. The corner of his mouth twitched. Not enough. With the volcano erupting behind him and the gargantuan wall of snow that connected heavens and earth racing to swallow him from the front, Sunny stared forward with a dark expression and did some mental calculation. I am no better than an artillery cannon distance-wise. Granted, that javelin of mine was about 25 times heavier than an average artillery shell. Still, I would need to be inside the storm to reach its eye. He grimaced with displeasure. All these mathematics was not exactly what he had wanted. What he had wanted was to get up close and personal with the winter beast and feel its blood flow down his hands. However, reality was never what one wanted. Well, maybe not, considering that Sunny had gotten exactly what he wanted. He had gotten his freedom, and everything else that had come with it. In any case, the distance was not that important. Much more important was the fact that the javelin had been able to survive for more than 20 seconds in the outer reaches of the snowstorm. That was something Sunny could work with. Of course, he still did not know how long his missiles would last in the inner hell of the winter beast's domain. He shook his head, let out a resentful sigh, and glanced at his shadow. War is a boring affair, isn't it, Serpent? Serpent raised its gargantuan head into the air and hissed, perhaps expressing its solidarity. Sunny smiled. Let's make it a bit more exciting then. As the first torrents of snow swirled around him and plunged the world into unbearable cold, Sunny raised his head to the dark sky and laughed. A few moments later, his laughter disappeared abruptly, and his face suddenly turned still. Only his eyes gleamed with a strange, dark excitement. Something stirred in their depths. And at the same time, the darkness around Sunny stirred as well. Dozens of inky black pillars rose from the ground, followed by dozens more. They rose into the swirling snow like the fangs of a dragon, their needle-sharp points parting the wind with shrill whistles. Then just as many tendrils of darkness wrapped around the shadow javelins, turning into inky black hands. Each hand had 7 fingers, ending with sharp claws. Sunny raised a hand, and at the same time the shadow hands raised the great javelins. He stared into the swirling snow with a cold smile. He was not satisfied with being a transcendent siege engine, to welcome the winter beast. He was prepared to summon forth an entire division's worth of devastating artillery. "I'm going to drown you, bastard." Letting out a low growl, he waved his hand forward. The world seemed to shatter from the thunderous roar when countless black javelins tore the swirling snow apart and shot into the depths of the raging blizzard. Dozens of black javelins shot into the raging snow, violently tearing a path through the blizzard. Each weighed more than a ton and moved with supersonic speed. The devastation they could visit upon the desolate landscape of the Antarctic center was immeasurable. But much more important than the kinetic force they carried was the mystical force of their transcendent nature. In the world of the nightmare spell, there were rules and laws that trampled reason. A corrupted titan like the winter beast could shrug off a railgun shell, but it couldn't ignore the blade of a saint. Sunny had always known about this odd dichotomy, but only now that he was a transcendent had he gained a hint of understanding regarding it. He had vaguely sensed on many occasions the world pushing against him, and his will pushing back against the world. The higher one's rank was, the more they were able to resist the pressure of the mundane and forcefully exert their will upon the world, as well as other living beings populating it, when 2 transcendent wills clashed. That was why, perhaps, a powerful abomination could survive a nuclear blast, but not a blow delivered to it by an awakened such as him, because an explosion did not carry an awakened's lethal will. In any case, the winter beast was going to have a problem dealing with the black javelins, both because of the mundane force they carried and the mystical force infused in them. That was if Sunny could actually hit the creature, of course. Blinded by snow, he closed his eyes and concentrated on sensing the shadows. His body was assaulted by unbearable cold, the crushing wind trying to bring him down. The wind was growing more ferocious, and the cold was becoming more calamitous by the second. The waves of heat rolling off the exploding volcano lessened the cruelty of the snowstorm a little, but not by much. Counting the seconds, Sunny concentrated on the distant place where the cold was the most terrible. Out there, even shadows could not withstand it, becoming frozen and still. There was a vast blind spot in his field of perception, so, even though he could not sense the body of the winter beast, he knew where to aim the javelins. Come on! There were almost 15 seconds left before his missiles reached the target area, which did not mean that Sunny would simply wait patiently. Serpent! Responding to his voice, the giant creature turned into a tide of darkness and flowed under his armor. A few moments later, it had already turned into a serpentine tattoo. As it did, Sunny sensed the amount of spirit essence he could absorb from the surrounding darkness increase dramatically. He suspected that it was either because of Serpent's new ability or because of its shadow guide, attribute having undergone an evolution. In the past, that attribute allowed Serpent to help Sunny control his shadow essence better. So who was to say that it couldn't guide the ambient essence of elemental shadows into his soul, as well? Thankfully, Sunny was currently shrouded in darkness. The twilight sky was obscured by the cloud of ash that had mixed with snow, so no light reached the plain. Even the red glow of the erupting Mount Erebus had been swallowed by the raging snowstorm, drowning the buried ruins of the destroyed siege capital in deep shadows. The lightless world was full of spirit essence, which was a good thing, considering that he was not holding back and burning through his own essence recklessly. Mort! Long before the first salvo of the black javelins reached its target, the second salvo flew into the seething veil of snow. The world shook and quaked from the deafening roar of their passing, and from the aftershocks of the continuing eruption as well. The third salvo was sent into the storm not long after that. For a while, Sunny was surrounded by a thunderous cacophony of violent shockwaves and the pained howling of the ravaged wind. A dark smile appeared on his face, and he basked in the cataclysmic fury that devoured everything around him. It was a shame that he could not use Serpent better in this fight. There were many forms that his shadow could assume, but none of them would really counter the profane power of the winter beast. On the contrary, all of them would be vulnerable to it. The same went for his avatars. Facing an enemy like that, his best strategy was to consolidate all the power available to him in one source, in himself. Still, it's not too bad. Sunny found the way the battle was developing rather exciting. That was until the first wave of javelins finally reached the heart of the snowstorm, though. His smile dimmed a little. Curses! The very first javelin had survived more than 20 seconds in the snowstorm, but the force of the wind and the fatal cold were much more dire close to the area where the winter beast was hiding. Some of the shadow projectiles were thrown off course by the hurricane, falling into the snow with thunderous explosions. The rest were swallowed by the cold and sapped of power, turning dead and brittle. Despite how much effort Sunny had poured into them, the speed and power of the black javelins ended up being insufficient. Even if they struck the body of the Titan, they would just shatter into ice without leaving a mark on it. As the fourth salvo shot into the snowstorm, Sunny dismissed the shadow hands and opened his eyes, looking ahead grimly. There was still hope. The winter beast was drawing closer with each second, so the second and third salvos would have spent less time in the blizzard by the time they reached its heart. And yet Sunny felt pessimistic. Just as he had expected, the second salvo only managed to devastate a swathe of the plain in front of the Titan's intangible fortress of fatal cold. The third one was swallowed without leaving a scar on the storm. He grimaced. No, it's for the better. Sunny had been afraid that there would be no chance for him to clash with the wretched creature face to face. No, it seemed that his worries had been unfounded. If he wanted to kill something well, he had to kill it with his own two hands. Was that the saying? As he sighed and took a step back, the fourth and final salvo hit. However, it did not strike the heart of the snowstorm. Instead, each of the javelins struck a particular spot on the vast field of snow, producing an earth-shattering explosion. And in response to that devastating attack, the snow split open across the entire region, unleashing a torrent of angry red glow. The entire region where Erebus Field had once stood suddenly fractured. Vast fissures opened in the snow, widening with each moment. Immense sheets of snow tilted and slid underground, collapsing as they turned into billowing avalanches. At the same time, the fissures glowed with angry red light, and torrents of lava shot from them, devouring the plain. The world was enveloped by a raging blizzard, so no one would have been able to see the awesome spectacle of the fiery cataclysm. Sunny himself only saw flowers of orange glow blooming here and there in the howling darkness. He swayed, struggling to stay on his feet. The chain reaction of chaos and destruction that the fourth salvo of the black javelins had caused was his measure in case a melee clash with the winter beast seemed unavoidable. The terrible heat of the molten lava was not going to put a dent into the titanic snowstorm, of course. In fact, the lava was already turning into volcanic glass. However, more of it shot from underground. An immeasurable amount of snow had been instantly turned into great clouds of boiling steam, which then swiftly turned into a torrent of hail. The whole world was torn apart by the clash between the incinerating heat and the obliterating cold, becoming consumed by chaos. The cold was winning, of course, but it was also being weakened, even if not by much. Considering that Sunny was about to face the very worst of it, though, every little bit counted. As for the sudden collapse of the snow field, that was Saint's doing. Fiend had been responsible for starting the volcanic eruption, but Mount Erebus was at a distance. If Sunny wanted to drown the winter beast in lava, he had to make sure that the whole region would crack open. That was not that hard to achieve, considering that the ruins of the siege capital buried under his feet were already unstable. With Saint creating channels for the lava to flow and deepening the already existing caverns, all Sunny had to do to cause a cascading collapse was deliver powerful shocks to shatter the meticulously prepared weak points in the icy crust. After that, nature would take its course. Of course, it was a bit degrading to use a great warrior like Saint to dig glorified trenches, but that was what made the winter beast so vile. Its cold countered most of Sunny's powers and made it impossible for his subordinates to fully exert theirs. I'll just have to make sure it pays for that affront as well. As he felt the very life being slowly sapped from his body by the killing cold, Sunny took a few more steps back and then inhaled deeply, ignoring the feeling of his lungs being cut by icy blades. Not that far now. The darkness around him surged, shrouding his figure in a vast mantle. He allowed himself to turn into an intangible shadow and then manifested himself back into the world, building a towering shell around the dark incarnation. This was the safest shell Sunny could create, one that posed no threat of his mind being pulled into the abyss of formlessness, because it was created in the image of himself. Slowly, a dark giant rose above the quaking plain. It was gaunt, with long hair that billowed in the wind like a sable waterfall. His eyes were like two abyssal wells, and the expression on his inky black face was both cold and savage. The hurricane wind crushed into the immense chest of the shadow colossus and was repelled, howling mournfully as it died. Vast plates of stone-like metal encased his gaunt and muscular body, creating a fearsome onyx carapace. As the heart of the snowstorm drew nearer and nearer, the dark giant slowly lowered himself, his knee sending a net of cracks through the thick layer of impenetrable ice. Then, he leaned down and supported his immense weight with both palms. Finally, the colossus grew still, his head lowered. His pose was like that of an athlete preparing to explode into a run. 20 seconds, huh? Sunny felt darkly fascinated by the immediate future. That was how long his javelins had been able to survive in the outer reaches of the snowstorm. Some had made it most of the way into the heart of the profane blizzard before turning into shattered ice. He was much more powerful than a manifested shadow, though. He was a transcendent terror, both his body and his onyx carapace augmented 5 times over by the shadows. Sunny was willing to bet that his shell would survive long enough for him to witness the true appearance of the winter beast. He would probably have mere seconds to live after that, though. So, something had to happen in those seconds to end the battle in his favor. I like it. A strange, sinister, thunderous noise suddenly resounded in the raging blizzard. It was the sound of the shadow colossus laughing. Then, his laughter turned into a chilling growl, and the towering giant exploded forward like a dark tsunami. An entire area of the snow field was obliterated by his initial push. A crushing shockwave spread from the point where Sunny's foot dug into the ice, but he was moving faster than it. Faster and faster and faster still. The shadow giant tore through the snowstorm as he ran, effortlessly leaping over the vastest of fissures and sending fountains of incandescent lava into the sky when he stepped in them, as if stepping into puddles. His speed increased more and more, until it was as if a black meteor was flying above the snow, moving parallel to it. The bitter cold sank into the towering colossus, trying to shackle him and slow him down. But Sunny simply broke through the cold, even as he felt the outer layers of his shell turn to ice. The heart of the snowstorm was already in front of him. He dove into its terrible embrace, trying to accelerate even more. In the end, the cold was just too much. With his giant body impacted by its fatal force, Sunny couldn't keep up anymore. He lost his balance and fumbled, almost falling down. There was no time to take the next step. And yet his speed was so great that he was carried forward by pure inertia. That inertia was just enough to bring him into the eye of the storm. There Sonny finally saw the winter beast. The frozen lips of the shadow colossus shattered into pieces as he bared his teeth in a vicious grin. "Well, aren't you ugly?" The snowstorm manifested by the winter beast was like a rolling cataclysm, with devastating winds carrying a seething mass of swirling snow and tiny ice particles. Close to its heart, the ice particles were like a myriad of razor-sharp blades, shredding anything that had not been frozen by the unholy cold already. Each of the countless shards of ice had been a part of someone slain by the blizzard once, perhaps. And yet, absolute peace reigned in the heart of the storm. A vast area beyond the invisible fortress wall of suffocating cold was entirely devoid of wind, snow, and ice. Everything was flawlessly still, as if nothing could move in this frigid kingdom, not even the winds of the blizzard itself. With the sky above shrouded by ash, it was dark here, with frozen rivers of lava glowing dimly as they turned to glass. The heat of the underground rivers of molten rock was powerless against the profane power of the corrupted Titan, and yet it was enough to buy Sonny a second or two more. The winter beast itself was floating above the ground, in the middle of its frozen kingdom. When Sonny first saw it, he was taken aback. The creature was eerie and grotesque, unlike anything he had ever seen. Just witnessing it made him feel appalled, as if his senses were trying to reject the existence of such a being. The winter beast could not be called a beast at all. Instead, it was an expansive, ethereal structure made of ice, as if countless torrents of water had frozen when they exploded outward from a hidden source. It would have been beautiful if it wasn't so organic. Although the Titan's body was made of ice, it also looked like a living creature. The twisting pillars of ice vaguely resembled parts of a mangled body. Limbs, organs, torn intestines, broken bones, and desiccated flesh. It was as though a giant being had been meticulously disassembled into countless parts, and then violently fused together in macabre disorder. There were dark shapes of other nightmare creatures fused into the ice here and there, as well, still and lifeless. The ice was pale and bleak, but the winter beast itself was nevertheless full of color. That was because numerous flowers bloomed on the ice, their petals an intense azure color. The contrast between their vibrant beauty and the appalling body of the creature beneath was hideously striking. Vast plumes of snow drifted from the flowers like pollen, shrouding the winter beast in a frosty haze. It was both beautiful and harrowing, but mostly harrowing. At the very heart of the eerie abomination, barely visible through the ice, a small shadow was encased in it. Sonny thought that it resembled the remains of a human being, but he wasn't sure. In any case, he was momentarily lost as to what to do. How was one even supposed to fight such a creature? But his hesitation only lasted for a split second. Still carried forward by inertia, and having lost his balance, the shadow colossus fell and rolled over his shoulder. The ground quaked from the terrible force of the impact, and the thin layer of volcanic glass cracked under his weight, a fountain of molten lava shooting into the air, only to freeze a moment later into an abstract sculpture. At the same time, the frozen pauldron of the onyx mantle shattered into countless pieces of black ice, and the giant's shoulder beneath it became covered by a net of deep cracks. The outer layers of the shell had already been turned to ice, and were now fracturing under the strain of his movements. It seemed as though the giant's skin was peeling, revealing the black mess of firm muscles underneath. It did not matter. Sonny was already exiting the roll, propelling himself forward into a powerful leap. The winter beast moved slightly, the azure mountain of its body hovering above the snow. Some of the twisting, vaguely organic pillars of ice moved, as well, unfurling slowly, as if preparing to explode forward and receive the shadow giant into their embrace. Sunny shuddered as he flew through the frozen hell toward the harrowing creature, but it was too late for regret. Now that he had jumped, there was no turning back, and no choosing a different strategy. Die! A stifled roar escaped through the dark giant's bared teeth. Sunny fell on the winter beast from above, but just then, countless spikes of ice extended from the creature's body and tore through his armor, impaling the damaged shell. Not paying it any attention, he immediately grabbed the thickest of the ice spears and pulled himself lower across its length, leaving a trail of dissipating shadows behind. In the place where his hand touched the ice, the gauntlet of the onyx mantle disintegrated into a haze of ice, and two of his fingers broke off. Sunny sensed the twisted pillars of ice flowing forward to encompass him. The unbearable cold permeated the entire mass of the shadow colossus shell, sending waves of pain through his soul. His dark eyes surged with murderous fury. In the next moment, the impaled giant slid low enough to reach the actual body of the abominable titan. His feet touched the ground. Crushing countless azure flowers, he stretched his hands and grabbed onto the grotesque shape of the titan, his claws digging into the killing ice. And then, Sunny pulled the winter beast into the shadows. "Let me help you off your throne, you abominable wretch." In war, the best advantage one could gain was fighting on a battlefield of their choosing. Sunny was currently in the very heart of the winter beast's storm, where his enemy wielded the most power. So, he was going to carry both of them away from this frozen hell. Shadow Step had undergone an evolution during his transcendence, so Sunny could carry living beings with him now. Sadly, he could not leave them in the dark realm of shadows, but he could very well transport them to someplace else in the material world. The range of his teleportation had also increased drastically due to how far his shadow sense could reach. Of course, teleporting a corrupted titan against its will, and over a vast distance, was going to burn an immeasurable amount of his essence. But it was more than worth it. Come with me, beast." He would have grinned if his lips hadn't been frozen and shattered already. Sunny exerted all of his power to pull the winter beast into the shadows. The titan tried to resist, but it was of no use. Perhaps if it had reacted sooner or knew the enemy better, such an outcome could have been prevented, but not anymore. Even when the hands dragging the creature into the darkness turned to ice and shattered, it was already too late. In the next moment, unbelievably, the crumbling giant made of shadows and the appalling creature of azure flowers and pale ice suddenly disappeared from the frigid stillness of the snowstorm's heart. A split second later, both of them emerged from the darkness in the infernal depths of Mount Erebus, plummeting into a vast lake of incandescent magma. Sunny's crumbling shell and the eerie ice flower of the winter beast's vessel plummeted from the darkness into the vast lake of bubbling magma. The frozen hell of the calamitous snowstorm had been left behind, and although Mount Erebus was already swallowed in its ruinous embrace, the unholy cold did not reach this underground cauldron. However, the winter beast had brought the cold, the snow, and the storm with it. The azure flowers growing from the corpses of the nightmare creatures that the ice had encased were still blooming with plumes of snow, and the creature itself was like the heart of an endless, empty, cold abyss. Several things happened before Sunny and his enemy plunged into the churning magma. First, the vast cloud of snow surrounding the winter beast instantly evaporated. Second, the surface of the fiery lake instantly cooled, turning into black glass. Third, the sudden changes in pressure and temperature, as well as the sudden expansion of a vast mass of boiling gas, caused a titanic explosion, throwing Sunny and the dreadful abomination apart. The explosion shattered the dome of the underground chamber and the crust of the recently frozen magma, which in turn started a chain reaction of devastating destruction. Far above and outside, the erupting Erebus shuddered and quaked, gargantuan stones exploding into the frigid air like cannonballs. A terrifying crack split one of its slopes, and after another cataclysmic quake, the entire side of the fuming mountain crumbled, letting the wind, the ice, and the snow of the unholy storm pour deep into the interior of the erupting volcano, where the blizzard came into contact with the endless mass of molten rock. A secondary explosion tore apart the snowstorm and shook the very heavens, much more terrifying than the first. As indescribable destruction spread, a towering mushroom cloud rose above the frozen ruins of Erebus Field, dwarfing the first one. All across the Antarctic center, the ground shook. Avalanches rolled down from snowy peaks, and several mountains collapsed. The ice encasing the frozen ocean split open, and towering waves of black water rolled from below. Deep underground, Sonny felt like he was caught in the middle of a collapsing star. Bombarded by devastating concussive waves from all sides, wreathed in incinerating flames and suffocating cold, he moved his damaged shell to dodge the giant boulders that fell from above. The boulders crashed into the crust of frozen magma, breaking it and causing immense geysers of molten rock to shoot upward. Those geysers were immediately frozen, turning into glass pillars, only to be shattered a moment later and collapse in a rain of obsidian shards. It was a scene of absolute chaos, like a chilling glimpse of fiery hell. Sonny wanted to laugh. Did I complain that the battle was not exciting enough? In this life, it seemed, all his wishes were destined to be granted. The mangled colossus made of pure darkness lunged toward the grotesque shape of the winter beast. The shell was in poor shape. The onyx mantle was cracked and fractured all over. It was repairing itself, but not fast enough to make a difference. His face was missing most of its skin, revealing his black teeth and slightly protruding canines. In that moment, it resembled Weaver's demonic mask much more than his face. Both hands of the dark giant had turned to ice and shattered when he grabbed the winter beast, leaving him with no means of holding a weapon. But that was fine. Sonny himself was a weapon. Reaching the Titan in several ferocious leaps, Sonny used all of his mass and all of his momentum to deliver a devastating kick to the eerie ice creature. The blow was truly terrifying. Even though the winter beast had used countless tendrils of ice to block it, most of them were shattered and exploded into a barrage of deadly ice shards. A net of cracks spread over the innermost surface of its hideous body, as well. Much more importantly, the creature was thrown down, crashing through the crust of magma and plunging into the flaming depths of the hellish cauldron. Of course, Sonny was not unscathed either. In fact, his entire left foot had turned to ice and broke off, taking with it the better part of the shin. He briefly thought that the sight of him would be rather comical if it wasn't so terrifying, because losing 3 out of his 4 limbs did not quench Sonny's murderous wrath one bit. The crumbling colossus roared viciously as it fell. The winter beast was not damaged by the incandescent magma at all, even if it directly opposed the power of unholy cold. Instead, the entire lake of magma cooled, its very heart turning into a vast expanse of black glass. Thanks to that, the Titan was momentarily trapped in obsidian, fused into it like the corpses of the nightmare creatures were fused into the hideous ice of its body. Sonny was full of furious glee at receiving that moment. Using the feather of truth, trait of the onyx mantle, he turned himself as heavy as he could and toppled straight onto the immobilized abomination. With no hands to deliver a blow, he brought his head down on the cracked ice. The force of the impact was so terrible that there was a flash of light, and the entire mountain shook. The dark giant's skull cracked, but the cold carapace of the winter beast finally cracked as well, a myriad of ice shards flying away. It moved, easily breaking free of the obsidian lake. The gargantuan stalks of ice moved as well, wrapping around Sonny and pulling him closer to the ice. At the same time, ice spikes formed below him, shooting forward to impale his mutilated shell. The upper part of his broken head was already fused with the ice, turning still and brittle from the frost. Almost immobilized, Sunny was being swiftly assimilated into the winter beast's body. All around him was pale ice, painted beautifully in shades of vivid azure. He was caught exactly where he wanted to be. Instead of trying to free himself from the icy tomb, Sunny used his broken limbs to push himself further down, into the fracture that he had created in the frigid carapace of the profane Titan. And there, he snarled and used his bared teeth to bite down ferociously on the vague shape at the heart of the eerie ice creature. The skull of Sunny's battered shell had cracked, and the upper part of it had fused with the ice. That part was torn off when he pushed what remained of his body into the fractured ice, spilling shadows like a tide of black blood. But his jaws were still intact. With most of his limbs gone and his colossal body swiftly turning into ice, Sunny let out a frenzied growl as he opened his skeletal maw and bit down on the small silhouette encased in the heart of the winter beast's appalling vessel, slicing it in half. A moment later, his teeth exploded into a rain of ice. His mutilated shell was far too damaged and would have already crumbled if it had not been fused into ice, becoming a part of it. His soul was cold enough that even the terrible pain ravaging it had been swallowed by a peaceful numbness. That peace was a herald of death. But none of it mattered. Because the moment Sunny destroyed the source of the winter beast, the abominable sculpture of ice that served as its body shuddered. And then it started to crack. He heard a gleeful laughter ring in his mind, breaking through the haze of stillness that was consuming it. Glee, triumph, vindication, pain, sorrow, guilt, hatred. Countless emotions were fused into that laugh, creating an eerily disturbing mixture. Sunny recognized the laughter as his own. Or was it a scream? He was laughing because the winter beast was dead. There was no nightmare spell to celebrate his kill, but Sunny had sensed a trickle of shadow fragments entering his soul. The harrowing Titan, winter beast, the bane of the Antarctic Center and the executioner of Falcon Scott, the abominable horror that had stolen the lives of Sunny's soldiers and taught him how unbearably crushing a defeat can be, was gone. Slain by his own hand, no less. Vengeance was so sweet. But that sweetness was also so indescribably bitter, because it carried the memories of what it was exactly that Sunny had longed to avenge. Imprisoned in the depths of a frozen shell, Sunny cut off his senses for a fleeting moment. Left alone in the darkness, he whispered, This is for you." It was for Belle, Dorn, and Samara, for Professor Obel, Sergeant Jeer, and Lieutenant Karen, for numerous others who had perished in Falcon Scott, and for Sunny himself, who had to live with the scars that the winter beast had left on his soul. Now let's finish this. The abominable Titan was dead, but the ordeal was not quite over yet. Sunny was still trapped within the icy tomb of the winter beast's vessel, and the world was still quaking all around him. Fearing that the spreading cold would reach the very depths of the frozen shell and swallow his soul, Sunny dismissed the dark giant. However, the broken colossus did not dissolve into shadows. Eerily enough, those parts of it that had been turned to ice by the Titan remained solid despite being released. All Sunny managed to do was create a sphere of empty darkness around himself, where the cold had not yet reached. He hesitated for a split second, then summoned more shadows from the lantern and swiftly built a new shell in the broken remains of the old one. The appalling figure of the winter beast was still half buried in obsidian, towering above it like a hideous masterpiece of sinister art. The azure flowers were wilting. A few moments later, they caught a flame and turned to ash, disappearing into the dark winds of the underground cauldron. A few moments more, and the cracks covering the carcass of the dreadful Titan widened, and then exploded outward when two black hands tore through the ice from the inside. Sonny crawled out of the crumbling titan and allowed his second shell to dissolve. Now outside the body of the winter beast and able to use shadow step again, he instantly teleported some distance away, stepping on the black obsidian with bare feet. The damage to a shell was not transferred to the body, but the onyx mantle was truly in tatters. It was going to take some time for his armor to restore itself, so, for now, Sonny was left standing there in nothing but the rags of his military bodysuit, no different from how he had been when he returned to Antarctica. He took a deep breath. Somewhere outside, far away, the terrible snowstorm was dying down. The profane power that supported it was gone, and so it was going to disappear without a trace before too long. The worst of the eruption seemed to have already happened as well. Most of the lava that had flown from Erebus had been cooled by the blizzard, solidifying into glass and stone. That said, the volcano had been terribly damaged, an entire side of it having collapsed to reveal the fiery caverns within. Sonny suspected that, if not for the ash, he could have looked up and seen a fragment of the bleak sky even from these depths. The ground was still quaking, but not as much as before. He waited for a bit, ignoring the sweltering heat and holding his breath in the suffocating fumes of the active volcano. In front of him, at some distance, the corpse of the winter beast was slowly crumbling. The azure flowers were gone. The pale ice was shattering, unable to withstand its own weight anymore, and melting. The desiccated corpses of the nightmare creatures that had been encased in it caught flame and were scattered by the wind. Soon it was all over. Full of an indescribable feeling, Sonny slowly approached the place where the winter beast had died. His enemy was gone, and all that remained was a scattering of shimmering soul shards, the fragmented remains of his frozen shell, and a barrow of pale ice. There was no sign of the vague silhouette that he had bitten in half anywhere in sight. It must have turned to ash like the rest of the corpses fused with the abomination. The remaining ice, what had been the innermost core of the Titan's body once, was not melting, but neither was it radiating a sense of fatal cold. That cold was there still, but now it seemed to be contained within the ice instead of spreading outward like a curse. In the flaming darkness of the obsidian lake, the mystical ice looked almost like frosty metal. Sonny hesitated for a few moments, then sighed, coughed violently, and summoned the covetous cougher. He placed everything inside, the soul shards, the fragments of frozen shadows, and the pieces of pale ice. It's over. The winter beast was dead. He had settled the score and avenged himself. He had avenged everyone else as well. His business in Antarctica was finished. Suddenly, Sonny looked tired. He glanced around, his gaze a little lost, and then asked quietly, "Now what?" Of course, there was no response. There was no one to respond either. In the silence of the obsidian lake, Sonny rubbed his face tiredly and closed his eyes. "I'm tired of this place. Not the depths of Mount Erebus, not the ruins of the Erebus field, and not even the Antarctic center. Sonny felt tired of this world. Nothing was holding him back here anymore. And so he decided to leave. A dozen seconds later, his figure disappeared from inside the broken volcano and off the face of the earth. He would not return to the waking world for 3 long, lonesome years. Cassie slowly closed her eyes and turned away from the young man sitting in front of her. His delicate appearance, polite demeanor, and modest smile were so unlike the frightening, unhinged demon she had witnessed in his memories. Witnessing one's memories was a strange affair, because what had been and what people remembered were usually 2 different things. Memories were vague, disjointed, and fragile, like the fragments of a fleeting dream. Some were vibrant and deeply etched, some were dull and shallow. Some were bright, most were full of sorrow. But the Shadow Saint possessed an unbelievably clear memory. It was striking, second only to Cassie's own now that she had transcended. It was as if nothing he had experienced were ever truly erased, at least not the details of the memory he had chosen to show her, which must have been important to him. What an irony, then, that his whole existence had been erased from the world. There was a problem with reading his memories, though. Firstly, the way the man who called himself Sunless perceived the world was simply too strange. Even Cassie, who was uniquely suited to having multiple points of view, and had already experienced the way he sensed his surroundings through her ascended ability, found herself feeling dizzy from the avalanche of unfamiliar sights and sensations. Secondly, and more importantly, there were countless gaps in her recollection of what she had seen. Those were the moments where the young man pretending to be a humble shopkeeper thought, spoke, or felt something about the places and events that had been erased from everyone's memories. In the end, what she had witnessed, or rather, could remember witnessing, was even more disjointed than the memories of ordinary people. The chilling images. A young man with alabaster skin crawling from the black water on the cracked ice, his eyes brimming with unfathomable darkness. The eerie city where a terrible slaughter had taken place, but only emptiness remained. The days of slaughter across the desolate expanse of the abandoned continent, the snow turning crimson from the spilled blood. An aloof figure observing from a cliff, as an army of enslaved nightmare creatures marched to their deaths into a raging blizzard. The furious battle under the slopes of an erupting volcano, the harrowing strength both the monster and the man had shown, the culmination of it all and so much more. Cassie scowled. Why was it so hard to cling to the very idea of it? She had to know. Countless thoughts surfaced in her mind, clicking together as they assembled into chains of logic. The frozen siege capital, it must be Falcon Scott, the fallen bastion of the Antarctic Center. He had returned there as a former member of the 1st Evacuation Army. That winged beast he used as a mount was unmistakably a spire messenger. I was right. After all, he was with us on the forgotten shore. However, the Fire Keepers only joined the Southern Campaign after the Antarctic Center was swallowed by the chain of nightmares, which means that he was never one of us. What relationship did we have? This strength, was he one of Gunlog's lieutenants, a prominent hunter of the outer settlement, someone who paid tribute to live in the castle like Kai and Aiko? He could have been sent to the Forgotten Shore the same year as Cassie and Nephis, but that was exceedingly unlikely. There had been only 3 people who reached the Dark City that year: Castor, Nephis, and Cassie herself, due to being dragged along by Nephis. Or no, had there been someone else? Her memories were vague, which meant. Her train of thought broke apart and faded, even the memory of having such thoughts disappearing from her mind. She vaguely sensed what had happened and tried to retrace the steps of her logic, but to no avail. So, Cassie continued to think and find more pieces to fill the void. Sonny allowed Cassie to contemplate what she had seen for a few minutes. He guessed that it was going to take her a while to come to terms with the winter beast's demise. However, she spoke sooner than he had expected. Turning to face him once again, the blind seer said evenly, "So, you are the Lord of Shadows." Sonny shrugged and smiled lazily. "What if I am?" She hesitated for a while. "I know that your second body is currently enjoying a tasteless theater play that we sponsored, while the third one is somewhere in Song Domain, hiding in the shadows. However, I can't sense the one in Godgrave at all. Curious." Cassie frowned. "A powerful anti-divination memory, perhaps, or maybe it's the nature of your citadel." Sonny tilted his head a little. "If you know that the play is tasteless, why sponsor it?" She shrugged. "Tasteless things have their use as well." How Machiavellian of her. Sonny remained silent for a few moments, then sighed. "In any case, I would prefer it if you didn't share the fact that the Lord of Shadows and me are the same person, especially with changing star. Cassie's frown deepened. You want me to deceive Nephi's? Why? He stared at her, with no particular emotion on his face. I get it that you are overwhelmed, Saint Cassia, but think about it for a moment. Unlike you, she is unable to remember that she has forgotten something. So, she wouldn't know that the three of us share a connection. All she would remember is that there is a person pretending to be a master here in Bastion, who is actually a powerful and not entirely friendly saint residing in a death zone. Our relationship would become strained in that case, and it definitely would not become any better. Sunny smiled. Plus, this incarnation of mine is really just a humble shopkeeper. It's like a vacation. I wouldn't want my peaceful life to be spoiled. Who knows what will happen to my mental state if my only source of peace disappears in a puff of smoke? Cassie met his gaze with her unseeing eyes, then sighed. Fine, I'll keep your secret. As long as you don't scheme to harm Nephi's, of course. If you do. Her expression didn't change, but the air in the stone chamber suddenly seemed terribly cold. Sunny's smile dimmed a little. Why would I harm Changing Star? She is the cornerstone of my survival after all, and therefore the integral part of my plans. The blind seer raised an eyebrow. Your plans? And what are you planning exactly, Lord Shadow Sunny? He laughed, then abruptly fell silent. After a while, Sunny spoke in a subtly insidious tone. Well, the future might be unknown to me, but one thing is certain. Very soon there will be a war for the throne of humanity. Anvil, Kai Song, maybe even that third one. They will clash, and knowing Changing Star, she will insert herself into that clash somehow, to slaughter them. He shrugged. So why not make sure that when the dust settles she is the one sitting on the throne? That is my plan, to hand her the crown. No matter how I feel about Changing Star, I absolutely despise those three ghouls, not to mention that I absolutely do not trust them to keep me alive. So there's that. Cassie remained silent, facing him with a frown on her delicate face. Eventually, she turned away. Time is short. The moon will disappear soon, so we must hurry to leave. I'll be waiting for our meeting next month. A crooked grin twisted Sunny's lips. As you wish, Saint Cassia. He rose, ready to activate Shadow Step, but then stopped. Sunny lingered for a few moments, then coughed and asked awkwardly, Oh, about that memory you wanted to commission. I am really quite good at making those, you know. Cassie tilted her head in confusion, then blinked. Right, the memory. Of course. I'll send someone to you in a couple of weeks with all the details. She took a step forward, coming practically face to face with Sunny, then placed her hands on his shoulders. Pleasure doing business with you, Master Sunless. He coughed. Ah yes, likewise, but why are you holding me? Cassie remained silent for a few moments, then elegantly raised an eyebrow. Because you need to teleport me out of this terrible place. You weren't thinking of leaving me here, were you? I hope not. In the courtyard of the nameless temple, a lonely figure was sitting on the black marble plates, shrouded in shadows. It was a young man with alabaster skin and onyx eyes, clad in an intricate suit of fearsome armor. His hair was long and darker than a raven's wing. In front of him, a frail tree was growing in the darkness, its branches brimming with wilting leaves. Sunny studied the tree and sighed. It's not doing well, despite my efforts. The tree was missing sunlight. What little of it there was in the outskirts of NQSC from where Sunny had stolen it. But it was resilient, just like the people there were. It had clung to life for a long time in that God-forsaken place, and now it continued to do so here, in Godgrave. Sunny felt guilty towards the tree. It was the one he had cut 2 lines into to mark the passing of his parents. After claiming the nameless temple and coming back to the waking world, Sunny visited NQSC and took the tree away from the pitiful park where it grew. Of course, he replaced it with a different one, People of the outskirts did not have a lot of vibrant things to look at, and he didn't want to rob them of another one. Not that it mattered too much. Most of the settlers who chose to pass through the dream gates were not citizens, but those who had been discarded by humanity and hoped to find a better place for themselves in a different world. As a result, the outskirts of NQSC were much less crowded than they had been in his time, and would only grow more desolate as time went on. In any case, the familiar tree stood in the courtyard of his citadel now, and Sonny often came to tend to it, or gaze at it as he contemplated various matters. It seems that Valor and Song have started preparations. It won't be long now. He sighed, then closed his eyes and dove into his soul sea. Such a simple thing, but it had taken Sonny more than a year to find a way back into the soul sea after being banished from the nightmare spell. Even then, he could only enter it after concentrating and meditating for a long time. At least for a while, he could do it on a moment's notice once again after another year of practice. The soul sea looked the same as it had before, but also entirely different. The vast expanse of silent water was the same. The 6 lightless suns hanging above it were also no different. However, now, a magnificent black temple stood in the middle of the lake, its pillars shrouded in darkness. It was a perfect replica of the nameless temple, which had appeared here on its own the moment Sonny claimed ownership of the ancient citadel. The Legion of Shadows, which had dwelled at the edges of the soul sea, were now gathered around the temple, just as lifeless and motionless as they had always been, of course. There were much more of them now, with several giant figures towering above the rest. It almost looked as if they would come to life at any moment, ready to enter the temple to worship its master. Sonny did not know what exactly had caused this change, but suspected that the soul seas of all saints were somewhat different from those of lesser awakened. A soul sea was the representation of one's soul, after all, and transcendence was all about the soul surpassing the limits of its mortal vessel. As such, he couldn't help but wonder what the soul sea of a sovereign would look like. What about a sacred being, or a divine one? Would the soul of a deity contain an actual realm? He didn't know yet, but maybe one day he would find out. In any case, for now, he had come here for a purpose. Sitting on the steps of the dark temple, Sonny sighed and summoned the images of his shadows. Soon, 5 figures appeared in front of him. Saint Serpent, Nightmare, Fiend, and Mimic. He studied them silently. There was more than one thing he had to discover anew after losing the helpful guidance of the spell. Entering the soul sea was one, but nurturing his shadows was another. Only after being left alone had Sonny learned clearly where his aspect ended and the nightmare spell began. Creating shadows was a facet of his aspect. Making them stronger by feeding them memories, however, was a helpful tool the spell had graciously provided, building it around his innate powers. It was reasonable, in hindsight. Memories were born from the spell, after all, so it wouldn't make sense for shadow creatures to be dependent on them for growth. The same could be said about echoes, which were similarly of the spell. It wouldn't make much sense if the only way to create a shadow was through an echo. So Sonny had to discover a new way, the true way, to accomplish both of these things. He had succeeded only partially. Sonny still had no idea how to create a shadow without an echo, but he had discovered ways to empower most of his shadows. Fiend was the easiest to deal with in that regard. All he needed was to devour powerful creatures or potent mystical materials to grow. Granted, his stomach was truly bottomless. The rascal had been feasting on all kinds of dreadful nightmare creatures for many years, but only advanced to the supreme rank recently, after consuming that great demon some days back. All of his attributes and abilities had grown stronger, but Fiend had not gained any new ones yet. The secret to Serpent's growth was also rather simple, since that shadow had always been unique. Its rank depended on how well Sonny had mastered Shadow Dance, while its class was equal to that of its master. Sunny could not receive aspect legacy relics anymore, however. He could still advance in his mastery of it. When that happened, Serpent would become supreme as well. Granted, he was wary of diving deeper into Shadow Dance due to losing his true name. Meanwhile, Nightmare had already become a transcendent terror, reaching the same class and rank as Serpent. It had taken Sunny a long time to figure out how to make this shadow of his stronger in the absence of the Nightmare spell, but the solution was simple. Nightmare fed on the dreams of powerful creatures. He subjugated them but could also consume them. That was how it could reach a higher rank, even though the process was slow and fraught with danger. The way for the marvelous mimic to grow was also not that hard. It could produce soul coins by devouring living beings. Those soul coins could be used by anyone to strengthen their soul, but if fed back to the mimic, they would strengthen it instead. However, Sunny did not really need Mimic to rise in rank, for now. The most important traits of the marvelous Mimic, the volume of its dimensional storage and the intricacy of the shape it could assume, depended on the potency of its master's soul, not the shadow's own. And finally, there was Saint. Looking at her, Sunny sighed. She was the only one he didn't know how to nurture yet. In the past, Saint grew in rank by consuming memories with the help of the spell, but now there was no way he knew of to strengthen her. As a result, his very first shadow had remained a transcendent devil to this day. Of course, as far as transcendent devils went, she was by far the most deadly one he had ever seen. But is it enough for what is to come? Sunny didn't know. Hearing someone walk across the marble floor of the dark courtyard, he dismissed the images of his shadows and left the soul sea. It seemed that he had a visitor. Sunny opened his eyes and summoned the helmet of the onyx mantle, hiding his face. Its visor was not as ferocious and eerie as Weaver's mask, but it was also fearsome. Deep shadows dwelled in the crack of the visor, hiding his eyes, and the black plume of the onyx helmet moved slightly in the wind. A moment later, the darkness of the courtyard was dispelled by soft light. Sunny did not move, waiting for Nephis to approach. Of course, he was observing her through the shadows. A dull pain suddenly pressed on his heart. She has changed. The source of light was Nephis herself, a ball of white flame dancing on her palm. He remembered that she had used a few memories to produce fire and light in the past, after returning from her second nightmare to spare herself the pain of calling upon her aspect. But now, it seemed, that was not the case. She reached him and remained silent for a few moments, looking at the frail tree with a slight frown. Soon enough, her gaze grew a little confused and then cleared. "Is that a mundane tree?" Sunny nodded. "Indeed, I'm afraid it is not doing well here in the dream realm, away from warmth and light." He had tried many ways to substitute both through sorcery, of course, with little success. Nephis remained silent for a moment. "The aspect of one of my people, Shakti, has to do with nurturing plants. I can ask her to take a look." He turned his head slightly, staring at her with his own pair of eyes. "That would be appreciated." She smiled faintly and looked at the wilting leaves. "I must admit, though, I never imagined someone like you would feel sentimental about a tree, Lord Shadow." Sunny tilted his head. "Someone like me." Nephis nodded. "Someone who chooses to live alone in the middle of a lifeless death zone, battling hungry abominations." He stared at her for a few moments, then shrugged. "This is the only tree in this lifeless death zone that has never tried to eat me. Of course, I am sentimental." With that, he rose to his feet and asked in a cold tone, "You are ready, then?" Now that the two of them had reached initial agreement, she had to go back to Bastion and report it to the elders of Clan Valor. However, Nephis and the Firekeepers were not going to repeat the long and perilous journey across Godgrave. Instead, It was much more convenient for them to place their anchors in the nameless temple. Once they returned to their tethered location in the waking world, another saint would bring them to Bastion. And once they were done in Bastion, Nephis would bring them back to the waking world. From there, all of them could return to their anchors in the nameless temple. The process was somewhat unwieldy, but effective. If Sunny allowed them to anchor themselves in the nameless temple, of course. But he had not. The fire keepers believed that it was because he didn't trust them yet. Nephis most likely suspected that he didn't want another saint, and anyone sworn to a domain, to contaminate his citadel with Anvil's authority. The truth of the matter was that he simply didn't want to give Valor easy access to his temple. The harder it was for them to reach it, the less they would bother him. So instead of allowing the fire keepers to place their anchors here, he would play the role of the ferryman himself. He would deliver them to the waking world, and then meet them there at an agreed-upon time to carry them back. This way, Sunny would be the only one who controlled access to his citadel, and therefore Godgrave. Before Nephis and the fire keepers left, however, they wanted to discuss the general points of their alliance with him. The better they knew what to expect, the more detailed the offer they would be able to bring back from Bastion. "Let's go." Soon, the two of them entered the main hall of the temple from one of the side passages. The fire keepers were already there, along with their annoying lanterns. Sunny sighed behind the visor of his helmet. It was so dark and peaceful here before. Apart from those brief few days last year, when a handful of scared sleepers resided in the nameless temple. His life here was rather peaceful. It wasn't going to be peaceful much longer. Sunny moved a hand, and the shadows rose from the floor, forming a detailed terrain map of the known part of the dream realm. The fire keepers stared at it for a few moments, then coughed and put the paper map they had brought away. Sunny approached the dark map and stared at it for a few moments. The hollow mountains rose like sharp fangs from the marble floor. Far to the south, a black castle stood in the middle of a black lake. A great bridge connected a tall peak to a formidable volcano, with a beautiful black palace perched at one of its ends. Below it all, a black ship drifted in a sea of darkness. Many lesser citadels were scattered here and there. He was looking at something else, though. A black skeleton with its head resting on the outskirts of the hollow mountains. Nephis studied the map as well, then let out a barely audible sigh. Finally, she said in an even tone, "The war between the Sword Domain and the Song Domain is inevitable. There is no connection between the two over land, and the House of Night is clinging to its neutrality despite the desperate attempts by both great clans to forge an alliance with them. Which means that a land bridge must be created, and will be created." She pointed to the black skeleton. "That land bridge is Godgrave. The great clan that conquers it first will have the ability to launch an invasion into the territory of the enemy. Even if a full invasion is impossible due to how well fortified the enemy is, the side controlling Godgrave can harass the adversary, disrupt supply chains, conquer weaker citadels, and strengthen their domain while weakening the other." Nephis looked at Sunny. "So, Lord Shadow, you must understand what it means." He remained silent for a few moments, then said with cold indifference, "It means that neither side can allow the enemy to take Godgrave. So, this death zone will not be a land bridge to start the war, but instead the battlefield where the war will be fought." And therefore, his peaceful life was as good as over. Sunny remained silent for a few moments, staring at the map. Then, a hollow chuckle resounded from the depths of his black helmet, sounding a little sinister in the darkness that shrouded the silent hall of the temple. Fighting a war in Godgrave, what a brazen act of madness. But I did not expect anything less from the great clans. The fire keepers glanced at each other, sensing a hint of contempt in his cold voice. Eventually, one of them said stiffly, "We are representing one of the great clans too, you know, Lord Shadow. Sunny simply turned his head, staring at him. The Fire Keeper trembled under his gaze, looking away from the impenetrable darkness nestling in the visor of the onyx helmet. It was as if there was no person inside the fearsome black armor at all. Nephi's, however, only seemed curious. She looked at him and asked, her voice even. "You have a relationship with the great clans?" Well, of course she was curious. Logically speaking, a saint like Sunny could not have appeared without brushing sides with at least one of the great legacy clans. It was much more likely that he had served either Valor, Song, or Night directly in the past. He was independent now, and seemed to harbor resentment toward the great clans. Anyone would be curious to know the reason. Sunny shrugged. A relationship, I guess, although it might be called a one-sided relationship by some. He turned his gaze back to the map and made the shadows move. The mountains crumbled, the sea of darkness vanished, and the black skeleton grew larger, reaching the size of an average human. Everything else disappeared, leaving only Godgrave and its vicinity in sight. So how will the war start? Nephi's remained silent for a moment, then turned to the map as well. Clan Song is already building a road to the right hand. They will use it to scale the skeleton and establish a fortress on its right shoulder. Valor is also moving its forces, aiming for the left hand. They will be delayed a little by the need to build a bridge. The left arm of the colossal corpse was broken, a vast distance separating the ulna and radius from the humerus. There was a significant difference in height, as well, so construction of the bridge would take some time. Nephi's continued. In the end, though, it doesn't matter. There will be a fortress established on the left shoulder of the giant, and its ribcage will become a war zone. Of course, fighting under the open sky is dangerous, but the hollows are not something the soldiers of either of the clans can handle, at least not in the initial stage of the war. Sunny tilted his head. The initial stage. She nodded calmly, studying the black skeleton with intense focus. Yes, the initial stage will be about slowly conquering territory and positional warfare. Godgrave is a death zone, so claiming it won't be easy. But its fall is inevitable, because that is the will of the sovereigns. The armies will advance, sealing cracks in the bone to cut off the nightmare creatures from spawning on the surface. Nephi's paused for a moment. The army of the sword domain will hold an advantage during that stage firstly, because it has more experience in waging war against the dream realm. Secondly, because several saints who are uniquely suited for the task serve the king, like Sky Tide. Sunny frowned behind the visor of his helmet. Saint Tyrus commanded wind and storm clouds. Her aspect would indeed be invaluable in Godgrave, where the veil of cloud stood between all living things and complete annihilation. That would undoubtedly make her a target. Already knowing the answer, he nevertheless asked, "When will the initial stage end?" Nephi's glanced at him somberly. "Once enough of Godgrave is taken for both armies to locate and conquer a citadel. The second stage will be about conquering more of them, and the last stage will be about pushing the devastated enemy off the skeleton and claiming it entirely, followed by a period of consolidation and an inevitable invasion into the weakened enemy domain, no doubt." The Firekeepers were strangely silent. They seemed to have known that a war was coming, however. Perhaps it was their first time hearing someone talk about the inevitable so openly. Nephi's lingered for a moment. "Do you understand why conquering that first citadel is so important, Lord Shadow?" Sunny's mood suddenly plummeted. "I do. It was because the moment one of the armies took a citadel, the domain of their sovereign would enter Godgrave as well, and that would allow that sovereign to exert their full power in a vast area around the citadel. Once that happened, the previously unapproachable hollows would not be that impossible to traverse, and the nature of the war would change. The more of these strongholds were conquered, the wider the domains would spread, eventually swallowing all of this region. Then it wouldn't be just awakened, ascended, and saints spilling blood on the ancient bones. Anvil and Kai's song could very well clash directly, splitting the heavens and shattering the earth. Sunny felt a hint of dread and smiled darkly, excited by that half-forgotten feeling. Nephi seemed to have noticed that the shadows drowning the great hall moved slightly. She shook her head. So, Lord Shadow, you must understand that maintaining the neutrality of your temple will be hard. Possessing a citadel at the very start of the war is too great of an advantage. No matter what else my elders might desire, they'll be most passionate about this point. Sunny laughed. Oh no, actually, I think it won't be hard at all. He tilted his head a little. No matter how greedy they are to have my citadel, they are much more wary of seeing it fall into the enemy's hands. So, if they don't want to agree to my suggestions, why, I can just go and offer my services to Song. The Queen's daughters might prove to be more accommodating than your elders. Oh, and they are also very easy on the eyes. One of the fire keepers coughed, prompting Sunny to wonder if there was something wrong with his lungs. Nephi's tilted her head and stared at him, most likely considering the blatant threat. After contemplating for a while, she asked, "And I'm not?" Sunny froze. "What?" Nephi's had a look of contemplation. "You said that Kai Song's daughters might be more accommodating and are easy on the eye, alluding to the fact that both of these factors are advantages Clan Song has over valor. But I am also King Anvil's daughter, meaning that I'm at a disadvantage in that regard. Are you hinting that Clan Valor should make more concessions in the negotiations due to my poor looks?" Now, Sunny felt that there was something wrong with his lungs. Desperately suppressing a cough, he tried hard to present a cold and aloof front. Damnation, is she having one of her moments? No, she must be teasing me, right? When he spoke, his voice was slightly dull. "No, your beauty is radiant and blinding, Lady Nephi's. I wouldn't dare." She looked at him for a few moments, then smiled. "Really? It's good then. Oh, but if you prefer, I can ask the elders to send Morgan here next time." Sunny was internally cursing himself for deciding not to wear Weaver's mask today. Someone else was cursing him as well. The firekeepers were keeping their voices down, but they underestimated the hearing of a saint. "That guy, who does he think he is, critiquing Our Lady's appearance?" says the man who hides his face behind a mask. "He must be as ugly as a toad, frivolous and shallow." He gritted his teeth behind the visor of the onyx helmet. "What toad? What the hell is a toad? My face is so handsome that it can fund an entire business, you good-for-nothings." What did these fools know? Outwardly, though, he remained cold and detached. Even if it took some effort. Having a secure base in an otherwise deadly region is already enough of a boon. If Valor wants to claim my temple, they can come and conquer it. Or rather, they can try. The last word sounded especially sinister. His tone didn't change, but it sounded exceedingly threatening all of a sudden. Nephi's kept silent for a bit, then shrugged. "I see. Do you know of any other citadels in Godgrave, then? Advanced knowledge of their locations can be just as important." Sunny glanced at the black skeleton. "There are none on the surface. There are a few in the hollows, though. I've seen a couple from afar. As for the Sea of Ash, even I am not brave enough to descend there." She seemed interested in what he had said. "You've explored the hollows?" Sunny nodded. "Somewhat, but not extensively. It is a deadly place." The firekeepers paled. If even a saint who lived in a literal death zone called a place deadly, then it had to be worse than hell. Nephi's lingered for a while. Eventually she nodded. "I think I know enough to make a report to the elders. It's time for us to return." Before she could finish the sentence, though, there was a loud noise. Fiend shifted slightly, the infernal flames igniting brighter in his eyes. At the same time, a tall and graceful figure appeared at the entrance of the temple. It was Saint. However, right now, her dark elegance was nowhere to be seen. That was because she was carrying something on her shoulder. That something was resisting and cursing desperately, powerless against the shadow's stone grip. Let me go, abomination. If you want to kill me, just do it quick. Why are you tormenting me? Sunny blinked. A human language. Why was there someone cursing in human language here, in Godgrave? Nephis and the firekeepers were similarly stunned. Saint walked toward them and unceremoniously dumped her burden on the floor. The person rolled on the marble tiles and scrambled to their knees, crawling back in fear. Stay back, demon. It was a very young and very dirty youth, his face smeared in mud and dried blood. He wore a torn armor that seemed to be a dormant memory, his body riddled with deep lesions. A moment later, the back of his head crashed into Neff's knees. He froze for a moment and then slowly looked up, his eyes widening in terror. Then an expression of utter shock appeared on his childish face. It was as if the young man's brain temporarily ceased all function. Ugh. He blinked. SS St. Nephis. She stared at him silently. The young man looked at her, then at the firekeepers, then at Sunny. Finally, his gaze was pulled back to Neff's beautiful face. His cheeks blushed uncontrollably. What are you? Am I dead? Is this paradise? She tilted her head a little, then said neutrally, This is the dream realm. Are you a sleeper? Sunny had already guessed that the dirty teenager was a sleeper. Last year, he had discovered a handful after the winter solstice and sent them to song. This year, though, he had not found anyone in the vicinity of his territory. He had assumed that either all of them perished in other parts of Godgrave, or the spell did not send anyone here this time around to begin with. Sunny was unclear on what motive the spell had to send sleepers to Godgrave, really. They had absolutely no chance to survive here. The last batch had only lived because of him. But then again, it might have been precisely because of his presence that the spell threw them here. It was a bit strange to imagine that he was powerful enough to be a factor in the decisions made by the spell. In any case, the young man gulped. A sleeper? Yes, I am. Wait, you are Saint Nephis, changing star of the immortal flame, Lady Nephis. What are you doing here? He paused for a moment, then added shyly, And where is here? Are we close to Bastion? She kneeled in front of him and gently placed her hands on his shoulders. A soft radiance enveloped them, spreading into the sleeper's body. The wounds covering it started to heal, and an expression of deep relief instantly appeared on his face. The sleeper stared at Nephis with wide eyes. His eyes were full of stars. Sunny shifted slightly. What is that bastard staring at with that expression? But then he had to mentally slap himself. Was he really feeling jealous of a poor sleeper? Nephi spoke in a tone that was considered soft for her. We are in a distant and extremely dangerous region of the dream realm. My warriors and I are here on an important mission. You are fortunate to have met us, young man. Otherwise, I'm afraid your fate would have been sealed. The young sleeper remained silent, looking at her with a strange expression. Sunny sighed. I did not think that any of the sleepers survived this year. Last solstice, I happened on a few and helped them escape. There seems to be just one survivor this time. His voice sounded cold and uncaring. Nephi spared him a glance, then turned back to the young man. Don't worry, the worst is behind you. You are safe now, we will take you back to the waking world. He took a shallow breath, closed his eyes for a moment, then desperately shook his head. No, you mustn't. I'm not the only one. There are others as well. We hid ourselves and clung to life for many days, but then there was no more water. Someone had to go out to try and find help, and I volunteered. Sunny sighed behind his helmet. already knowing what was about to come. The sleeper grabbed Neff's arm and said hoarsely, "Please, Lady Nephi's, you are changing star, please save the others." Sunny was indignant. The spell, it has some nerve. First, it had abandoned him. Now, it was using him as a babysitter for unfortunate sleepers. He shook his head slightly, then asked, his voice grim, "Those others you mentioned, where are they?" As it turned out, there were 2 other sleepers somewhere out there, hiding under the roots of a dead tree in the hollows. They were well outside the Shadow Realm's fragment and inside the bones of the colossal skeleton, which made the potential rescue problematic. In fact, it was miraculous that they had survived for so long. Too miraculous, maybe. While the firekeepers were calming the dirty teenager and giving him food, Sunny stared at him coldly. He had already studied the sleeper's soul, making sure that he was indeed a dormant human. But why were Nephi's and her people so careless? He glanced at her, then asked, his voice emotionless, "How do you know that he's not one of Skinwalker's vessels?" Nephi's, who was standing a few steps away from the sleeper, shrugged. "If he was an abomination, my flames would have burned him, not healed him." Sunny raised an eyebrow. It made sense. Her soul was immune to corruption, so the flames of her soul did not tolerate it. Granted, Nephi's had not yet mastered that aspect of her powers to such a degree in the past. All right, he's not Skinwalker. That didn't mean that the sleeper was harmless, though. He could still be a body Mordred decided to wear. Granted, that was very improbable. It would be exceedingly hard to find a sleeper just a few days after the winter solstice, let alone drag one to Godgrave. And while Mordred was powerful, it would be harder still to traverse Godgrave in a dormant body, even for him. So why was this sleeper so strange? Sunny walked forward, and although he did not say anything, the fire-keepers instinctively parted before him. The sleeper looked up, his eyes suddenly widening in fear. My lord." Stopping in front of the teenager, Sunny looked down without saying a word. How strange. Even though he could see the dirty young man, he could not sense him. It was as though there was no one there. There was no scent, no presence, not even a shadow he could perceive. Was that why he had not sensed what Saint was carrying until she was already in the temple? The corner of his mouth twisted upward. "Is that your aspect?" The sleeper flinched, then looked down. "Why, yes, my lord, I am not good at anything except for hiding, but hiding I'm really good at it." Sunny tilted his head. What a powerful aspect. It wasn't easy for a dormant ability to fool the senses of a saint. Perhaps it wasn't completely unreasonable for the spell to send this poor child here. In any case, that aspect of his could somewhat explain how the sleeper managed to survive a short trip across Godgrave. "What is your name?" The young man shivered. It's Ray, my lord." Sunny lingered for a bit, then nodded. "All right, I've decided not to kill you, Dreamer Ray." Leaving the young man with his mouth hanging open, Sunny walked away. As he did, the firekeepers gave him a few dirty looks and returned to trying to calm the teenager down. Their previous efforts had been utterly invalidated by a few words from the Lord of Shadows. Nephi's glanced at him and raised an eyebrow. "Do you kill sleepers often, Lord Shadow?" Sunny contemplated for a few moments, trying to remember how many sleepers he had killed. In the end, he answered evenly. "Not often." Then he turned to face her and asked in the same emotionless tone, "What about you, Lady Nephi's?" She did not answer, instead changing the topic to the fate of young Ray's friends. "You are better acquainted with Godgrave. The 2 of us and my warriors, can we rescue the other 2 sleepers from the hollows? That is not the mission entrusted to me by Clan Valor, but still, if it is possible, I would like to save them." Sunny hesitated for a second. "Can we? Sure, it's possible. But your people, skilled as they are, there is no guarantee that all of them or any of them will survive in the hollows. You and I can try it alone, though." She nodded simply. "Then that is what we'll do, if you are willing." He stared at her silently, pretending to be surprised. "Are you fond of risking your life for strangers, Lady Nephi's? Braving a death zone for a couple of insignificant sleepers? Wouldn't it be a shame if someone as illustrious as you perished for no good reason? Why do it?" She smiled faintly. "Firstly, I'm not planning on dying here. Call me arrogant if you wish. Secondly, aren't you being a little hypocritical, Lord Shadow? No one forced you to rescue the sleepers last year, and yet you did. Not only that, but you even escorted them all the way to the territory of Clan Song. So please forgive me, but I know that you are not as heartless as you want to appear behind that mask." "Am I really?" Sunny frowned, deciding to act more tyrannical in the future. She turned and looked at him, her smile widening a little. "And most importantly, because I want to. That's the only reason I need." Sunny let out a chuckle. "Ah, there it is, she doesn't change." He shook his head. "What if all of this is an ingenious plot to lure you into the hollows alone, where I'll have an easier time disposing of you? What if I've already struck a deal with Clan Song? Aren't you afraid of following me into the darkness, with no one to cover your back?" Nephi's remained silent for a bit, then shrugged nonchalantly. "Shouldn't you be afraid of following me into the darkness instead? This citadel of yours is very valuable. What if I already received orders from Clan Valor to eliminate you and make it my own?" Sunny stared at her for a bit, then let out a cold laugh. "Now that you mention it, I probably should be afraid, but what a pity. I've been foolishly fearless as of late." There was a sinister note in his tone, as if he was inviting her to try something. Nephi smiled. "Being enslaved by fear is more foolish." With that, she threw one last glance at the sleeper. Her expression changed subtly, switching from composed languidness to a state of cold focus. "It might be for the better. I'll instruct my people to tend to your tree while we're gone. That said, time is of the essence. I suspect that these 3 sleepers only lasted that long because of this young man's aspect. He volunteered to venture out of their hiding spot thinking that he's the best person for the job, but the remaining 2 might be in danger without him. If they are still alive, we must find them as soon as possible." Sunny nodded. "Fair point. Go talk to your people and find out what else they've learned from the boy. We'll leave as soon as that is done." While Nephi's talked to the firekeepers, he lingered for a while observing her. His mood was rotten. Damn it, I didn't want to reveal what is hidden in the hollows to her. So soon. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and like the video and comment down if anything wrong in the story. And if have any suggestion to a new novel or want next part of any series, comment down. Our target is to get 1K subscriber. There will be surprise for all of you. Stay tuned.